With great pleasure to introduce Elizabeth Sampat from Future Games of London. She's the creative director here, and she's going to give a little talk and then open the floor for Q&As. And the topic is creativity as a discipline, how to come up with new ideas that really work. So I'm going to sign off and come back on for the questions. So over to you, Elizabeth.
Thank you so much, Ruth. Let me just start showing my screen. All right. Hi. As Ruth said, my name's Elizabeth, and I'm the studio creative director at Future Games of London, which is an Ubisoft mobile studio. Before I joined FGAL, I worked at Cybo, who are the creators of Subway Surfers, the most popular mobile game of all time. And before I left the US, I also worked at PopCap on Plants vs. Zombies 2. So having worked at studios that have created genre-defining games and blockbuster IP, I'd love to be able to tell you the 3 never-fail tools to coming up with your own totally new, innovative, wildly successful ideas. Unfortunately, I've never met a single person who actually knew how to do that, and I certainly don't either. That's one of the many reasons I think that the concept of the idea guy when it comes to games is so often sort of made fun of, because having one good idea or one hit game doesn't actually guarantee that you'll ever be able to replicate that success. One of the reasons that the burden of constant creativity in this profession can feel so challenging, I think, is because of the ways in which we romanticize creative work. People talk all the time about inspiration like it's we talk about writer's block as though it's a physical ailment, like it's tennis elbow. It's as though we ourselves are not creative people, but instead we're just conduits through which creativity flows. So I'd like to spend some time today talking to you about creativity, not as something you make yourself open to or tap into, but as a discipline that you really work at. My tips for active creativity are probably messier, sweatier, and at least at first glance, less creative than you may have been hoping that they would be, but at least they're tried and true. This is a pretty short talk. I wanted it to be 15 minutes of me talking and 15 minutes of Q&A. So I'm going to give you 10 tips very, very quickly. Tip 1, dismantle preconceived notions. From a creative standpoint, the idea of the blank page is both exciting and terrifying. Every step of the game design process is actually about limiting possibilities from a number of infinite paths and choices. But what we may not always realize is that our lives, our histories, our personalities, and educations affect the number of paths that we already have closed off to us in that infinite possibility space. We all come with our own cognitive biases and preconceived notions of what it's possible to do. So when you sit down to make a game, the first thing you should do is ask yourself, what are the things about this game that I think have to be true? And then ask yourself, but do they? Before you ever sit down to make a decision, it's worth interrogating those preconceptions and biases in order to come across questions you didn't even know you wanted to answer. After all, it's like if the only vehicle that you'd ever seen in your life is a sports car, you'd end up designing a pretty messed up looking fire truck. Creativity at its core is not just about deciding what paths you want to cut off. It's also about stumbling onto paths that may have otherwise remained closed off to you. Tip 2, creativity doesn't matter if execution is impossible. So this might be a controversial statement coming from a creative director, but between you and me, I absolutely hate blue sky design. I always say that my favorite creative space is blue sky with a couple of clouds. And that's because more often than not, my very best, most creative work is when I'm making the best out of a difficult situation. I can't say it more strongly than this. Constraints create creativity. So once you've gone through the first step and interrogated your cognitive biases, you should make a list of all of the constraints that you're working under. Do you have a deadline or limited resources or a whole bunch of one resource that you really need to make sure that you use up? What are the things about this project that you absolutely cannot change? Naming these constraints allows you to come up with a plan that turns those constraints to your advantage. And in combination with the previous point, it's actually an incredibly powerful step. Once you know the things that actually can't be changed, and you've freed yourself from the idea of things that you think can't be changed, you can see the entire landscape of possibility that's available to you. Keep your eye on the goal. Make sure you know what your goal is, first of all, and that the goal is something that's more specific than just make a cool game. Now, that might actually sound like the opposite of creativity, because after all, what if something cool comes out that doesn't actually achieve the goal you were trying to hit? In the best case scenario, you shot for the moon and landed among the stars. But in the worst case scenario, you ran out of money or time, or you didn't get the publisher you needed to get, or the award you were hoping to get, or whatever it was that you were actually trying to do. So if you remember what I said about constraints creating creativity, your goal is your biggest, wildest constraint, and you need to be hell-bent on that goal. It's easy to fall into the trap of thinking that creativity means never locking down your design, because that limits the possibilities for your game. But if you keep your goal in mind, that guarantees that you will continually be moving forward, which allows you to make powerful creative decisions at every step of the game development process. A lot of people think that the creative part of game development is just the concepting phase. But in reality, there will be plenty of opportunities for you to flex your creative problem-solving muscles long after the design and innovation of the game itself has been locked. 4, innovate in one area at a time. Now, this advice is specifically to ensure that you're investing your creative energy into something that's actually possible. The core skill at the heart of game design is actually just being able to forecast cause and effect. The more you truly understand the ramifications of each of your design decisions on the game as a whole, the better you are at game design. The difference between a good designer and a great designer isn't how creative their designs are. It's how far ahead they're able to forecast the effects of their decisions. Now, this gets tricky when you're making something truly creative that's unlike something that anyone has ever seen. All of a sudden, you have less previous experience or knowledge to base your forecasts off of, which reduces the likelihood that your forecasts of cause and effect are actually correct. If the premise of your game is based around a truly bold idea that breaks new ground, try to surround that idea with a tried and true support structure. Not only does this make your game feel focused and really highlight its unique selling points, but it also reduces the amount of uncertainty when it comes to the number of decisions that have difficult to predict consequences, which means that you're going to spend a lot less time in the weeds and become a lot more likely to hit that goal. There's no point in being creative for creativity's sake. Creativity is just a tool. It's a means to an end. Find inspiration outside of your discipline. So for me personally, one of the most nourishing things I do on a regular basis is to just seek out advice from creative disciplines that are both nothing like games and serve very similar purposes in the lives of their consumers. So for me, for example, my day job, as I mentioned, is making really big mobile games. So right now I'm on a kick about super deeply researching pop music. Pop music and big casual mobile games actually have a ton in common. Both are often made fun of by people who don't understand them and dismissed as being formulaic or uncreative. But both have the biggest audiences in the world, audiences in the hundreds of millions. The audiences for both giant mobile games and pop music also tend to be dismissed by the people who love those disciplines. You know, people who love One Direction are derided as not really being into music, the same way that people who love Candy Crush are considered to not be real gamers. So it turns out that people who are really good at making pop music say really smart things about their processes that help me be better at my job. So when I'm watching a masterclass by John Mayer, where he asks a room of the best and brightest music students, do you ever feel smarter than your audience? Because you shouldn't. If you think if you think that you're making a hit, but nobody cares, who is actually smarter than who? It reminds me not to underestimate my audience. So figure out what creative disciplines really speak to you, and what within those disciplines is similar to what you're trying to do. Then just seek out knowledge from the people who do that best. So speaking of John Mayer, this tip is something that I've always done, but he described this part of his songwriting process as Ouijaing it out. And honestly, it's the perfect description. Here's the thing. You actually know a lot more than you think you know, even if it's not always accessible. If you're not sure how to flesh out an idea or how to solve a problem, the most important thing you can do is find a way to get that inaccessible knowledge to come out. So for John, that means taking the interesting melody he's come up with and singing total nonsense over it until the words sort of start to sound like a song. For me, it means getting another game designer that I trust to ask me questions about the game and seeing what the hell comes out of my mouth. It sounds weird, but trust me, there have been so many times when a colleague has asked me a question and then said, "That's perfect. Why isn't that in the documentation?" And I've had to say, because I didn't know the answer until you asked me. And this is a trick that works at every single stage of game development. If all you have is the elevator pitch, get someone to ask you questions like the game already exists. When you're trying to flesh out your design, have someone ask you about the holes that they see. Just keep saying nonsense until it starts to sound like a game. 7, work with your hands. This is sort of related to the idea of Ouijaing it out, in that sometimes our conscious brains are going light speed working on a problem and without actually getting anywhere. And that can really burn you out. But it's also tricky because if this is an issue that needs solving, you can't just stop thinking about it. Or can you? When I'm dealing with some of the very toughest problems or feeling the most drained, spending at least an hour or two just working with my hands is the single most useful thing I can do. I've taken a metalworking class, I've learned to knit, I play the ukulele. When all else fails, I'll just build stuff out of Legos. The trick is to get so immersed in what's going on with your hands that it gets the very loud part of your brain to shut up and rest. The worst case scenario is that you come back to the problem with a refreshed mind. The best case scenario is that the time you spent not consciously thinking about the problem allows your subconscious to approach it from a new angle. Boom, problem solved. It's really important to make space for bad ideas. This is something that I think people talk about a lot in brainstorming, but they don't remember to do it during the actual decision-making process. If you hit a wall, ask yourself, what is the worst possible way to solve this problem? Because the funny thing is, most of what we assume are terrible ideas are just us self-censoring our intuition. Sometimes a terrible idea is actually good. Sometimes just giving ourselves permission to bring all of our ideas to the table is all we need in order to make that subconscious knowledge accessible. Not every idea has to be good, and often the only way to tell if an idea is good or bad is to actually just say it out loud and see how it sounds. 9, slow down and ask, and then what happens? So never forget what I said before about how game design is fundamentally about cause and effect. Every single choice you make has ramifications. And when you're really in the flow state as part of the creative process, when you feel like you're getting that bolt of inspiration out of the blue, it can feel like the entire game lives in your head, and it's your job to just get as much of that outline out as you possibly can as quickly as possible. But as exciting as those waves of inspiration can be, they can also leave really big holes in your project or lead to big, bold decision-making that has effects that you aren't necessarily thought through. If you experience one of these rare classic bolts of inspiration, I'm not telling you to ignore it. Definitely write it down. Just maybe don't write it down in your documentation. At this stage, that's not a design. Those are just notes. The next day, sit down and transcribe your notes from the day before into the documentation. But at every step, slow down and ask yourself, and then what happens? Make sure that the broad outlines of your design make sense and that you're coloring them in appropriately. Just because some ideas come from what we traditionally think of as creative inspiration doesn't make them inherently better ideas than the ideas that you generate through the active practice of creativity, and they need to be subject to the same scrutiny. Finally, never, ever stop being curious. Fundamentally, curiosity is the fuel for creativity. The act of wondering why something is the way that it is, or how it works, or what could happen next, is an invitation for creative thought. And really, that's all that these tips boil down to. Be curious about your preconceived notions of the world and challenge them. Be curious enough to seek out knowledge from other disciplines, from working with your hands, or just from deep inside of yourself. Let your curiosity drive you forward, even when you're at rest. The more you question, the more answers you'll find. Thank you. So that's my talk. I'm happy to open it for Q&A. Thanks, everybody. Do we have any questions? Do I have any advice for zoning in when you have multiple design solutions that are equally valuable? So this feels a little bit like a cop-out to me because I'm not super technical, but I find that the number one thing I can do is really prototype it. And even if you can't code, sometimes paper prototyping is really what works really well. If you have collaborators and a bunch of people are sort of bringing these multiple design solutions, I find that the best thing to do at the beginning of the creative process is to set creative pillars that you really agree on. And then as you're sort of looking at those multiple options, you can decide as a group, just measure them against the pillars that you agreed on at the beginning and be like, which one of these really gets us above and beyond? Which one goes the furthest to really achieve those creative pillars? And start with that one. Lucy finds it difficult to get her thoughts from her head to paper. Me too. Any advice? So that's where I think if you have if you have a friend that you really trust creatively or a collaborator, turning that into a conversation really helps. A couple years ago, 6 years ago, because time has no meaning anymore, I was up for an Indicate Award, and part of what they needed as part of the submission process was a video of me talking about my game. And to this day, this is a game that I made in 2014, and I still don't really know how to describe it. So what I had to do was just get a friend to sit behind the camera who'd played the game before and just ask me a bunch of questions about the game. And then I made the video by just splicing together my answers. The game was called Deadbolt. It's a tabletop game. You can't really find it anywhere because there's only one copy. But that I think is, just get somebody to pull it out of you if you can't pull it out of yourself. It's moving fast. How do I approach being creative when perhaps all the constraints aren't clear or being purposefully obscured? Perhaps someone already knows exactly what they want, but aren't sharing all the information about this. This is one of my number one pet peeves, honestly. And I think the most common example I run into with this is when doing like game design tests when I'm applying for jobs, because often they'll ask you to come up with a feature or come up with a new idea for something. And of course, they don't tell you, you know, how old the code base is, what it can actually take, what your resources have. And so in that case, what I like to do is really list my unknowns. And if I'm doing it specifically as a presentation for somebody who's withholding information, I like my response to be like, aha, I got you. And I put a whole slide in about all of the stuff they didn't tell me and say, you know, all of this would be subject to change because these are the things that in my real life I use to help narrow down my decision-making process. But if I'm doing it for myself, that's really when intuition is key. It's what is your overall goal? Because if you don't know all of the constraints because they're being purposefully obscured, then usually you're doing it for someone or working with somebody who's not telling you everything. So if you're pitching to publishers who aren't telling you all of the constraints, your goal is to get the game published, but maybe your goal is also to just impress the hell out of those publishers, in which case, what seems like the most interesting or ambitious or impressive way to go about doing that. Creating a sub-goal can often sort of help narrow that down. What do I think is my proudest achievement or a great creative breakthrough you had using my innovation process? Honestly, I think probably writing my book. I wrote a book in 2016 called Empathy Engines, Design Games That Are Personal, Political, and Profound. And I actually got started before I ever did games as a writer, but I could never write a full-length book. I always did essays and articles because I couldn't get past 30 pages. So this was really using the Ouija it out process. My spouse is also a writer, and they work in fitness, and we're writing a book on fitness at the time. So we had word count contests on the weekend where we would just sit down, and we're both super competitive people. And it would be who could get the most words done by 6 p.m. so that winner got to trash talk the other person all through dinner. And I don't think I would have been able to write that book if I didn't have external constraints sort of pushing on me to get those words out. Do I have any advice for when creativity is overflowing, but the focus and decisions are lacking? Yes. Let the creativity out. Let it just fly free for as long as you humanly can. You know, take a day when you've got the creativity hangover to just be a little drained and to be super proud of that big creative burst that you did. And then the next day after that, come back with your analytical mind and sort through the mess that you made for yourself, because it's a bunch of raw materials. And now you get to do what I actually find to be the most fulfilling part, which is to make something out of those building blocks that you sort of just let out. I like the comparison of game genres to pop music and its broad reach. Curious if you had advice for working with people who do not, in music terms, enjoy pop music, or rather do not like or play the type of game you're making. That is pretty much almost universally the experience working in mobile games. A lot of people who get into mobile games really wish that they were working in AAA, or got into games because they hoped they would work in AAA and then realized that they like the money and hours better in mobile. For those people, I think it's really important to find out what kinds of games that they like, and then try to get them hooked into games that aren't identical, but that sort of scratch a similar itch in your discipline, or in your genre of game, rather. I know, particularly in free-to-play, I've worked with a lot of people who said that they would never spend a penny in a mobile game, which is really difficult if they're designing mobile games, because part of what you're trying to design is the monetization, right? If you can't imagine ever spending money in a game, you're not going to design very good monetization. Or if you think that monetization can only come from exploiting players, then the only thing you'll do is exploit your players. So finding games that they find really exciting, that finally gets them to spend like that first 99 cents, I think can really click something on. But ultimately, you know, we can't force people into new experiences. It's just a matter of helping them find things that they think that might actually resonate with them. Jan, recently I tried developing a game idea on paper, but it grew and branched so far that it seemed impossible to realistically implement and balance. I had to decide if it's better to try to continue or scratch it and start something new. What's your advice for that kind of situation? Break it down in chunks. Go through that design and find the 3 to 5 things in that design that are the most exciting and compelling to you, and then make 3 to 5 different game specs. It's sort of like, I don't know if you've ever seen the movie The Devil Wears Prada, but Meryl Streep has a really great speech in there about how the ideas from like runway clothes trickle down into ready to wear clothes in like department stores or discount stores or that kind of thing. Oftentimes, if you pack all of your favorite ideas into one game concept, that's like a Christian Dior outfit going down the runway at Paris Fashion Week. It's nothing that anyone could possibly wear, but the buyers are in the audience going, oh, that hat's cool, or oh, I really like that silhouette. So figure out how to dismantle all of those great juicy ideas you have and give them each a chance to sort of shine in their own little place. And at the very least, who knows, maybe after you've made some of those games and you've gotten the experience and solved some of those problems, you'll be able to Voltron together that first game you were excited about in the first place. Thanks for linking my book, Vivian. Do you have any advice on creating great work more quickly? Tips on streamlining or simplifying the creative process or building systems for yourself within which to feel inspired and productive? Like I said, probably the best thing that's helped me is really tapping into my own competitive nature. So setting up goals for yourself, sort of turn the idea of making the game into a game for yourself. The more that you can motivate yourself with things that actually work, I think the better off you are. Make sure that you're leaving yourself some downtime for your brain to recover. But even in that downtime, like it's my downtime is when I'm, obsessively watching YouTube interviews with pop musicians to see what they're talking about. That's the time when I tell myself I'm turning my brain off, because it's something that I'm really interested in anyway, but it sort of help fuels that. So really the number one piece of advice I think I'd give there is just make sure that you're still building in breaks. Otherwise, you're just going to burn out. Alexandra, I might be repeating a topic here, but do you have any advice for deciding what to cut when you're trying not to overscope? Yes. So when you think about a game, and this is something that I learned actually from tabletop game design, if you put a system into your game, you are making the game, at least in part, about that system. I once talked to a university student who had a really great idea for a game that was like very emotional and sort of like this sort of Banner Saga-esque, but he had this whole subsystem in there for like passing weapons down from like through the generations. And I was like, okay, are these weapons like super important? Are they super meaningful? Do you name them? Like why are they being showcased so much by this whole system that you designed? And he was like, oh no, like the game's not actually about that at all. I just thought it was a really cool idea. And that's, I think, really where you've got to, that's really, I think, the bright line that helps you to decide whether to cut things. If something's a really cool idea and you're really excited about it, but it doesn't actually serve what the game is about to you, then set that idea aside. It's still useful, but wait until you're making a game that's actually about that. If the thing that you're cutting might have made that game a success, I don't think if you're cutting it, it would have. Maybe that's a thing that would make a different game a success. But sticking something really cool in a game that you wouldn't otherwise be interested in isn't going to get you an audience that you wouldn't have already had, if that makes sense. So yeah, I guess we're right at 12:30. You can find me. I'm at 2scooters on Twitter. My website's elizabethsampat.com. Thank you so much to the conference for inviting me and for suggesting this topic. I often suffer from imposter syndrome, so I never would have thought to give a talk about creativity, but it was the creative constraint I needed because I'd never really sat down and thought about my own creative process either. So again, thank you so much for having me, and I hope you have an amazing rest of the conference.
Thank you, Elizabeth. That was excellent and a lot of words of wisdom there, and it's evidenced by a lot of the questions that you got. So thank you very much for your contribution, and enjoy the rest of the conference, folks.
Thanks, everybody. Bye.
Okay, take care. Bye.